Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Tensions between China and Japan are entering a dangerous new phase, sparked by a recent comment from Japan's Prime Minister expressing support for Taiwan's autonomy. Now, Beijing responded with travel bans, ministerial snubs, and threats of further retaliation, calling the statement a provocation against its One China principle. But this clash is just the latest flashpoint in a much deeper rivalry, one rooted in history, regional influence, and shifting global alliances. U.S. President Donald Trump has re-engaged, speaking separately to both leaders last week, raising fresh questions about Washington's role in the region. And for South Korea, caught between its two largest neighbors, the stakes are rising fast as a new fault line takes shape across Northeast Asia. For a closer look into the current situation, we connect to Kim Mok-yeon, senior researcher at Gyeongsang National University's Korea Social Sciences Research Institute. A big welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And also joining us online is Christophe Godin, professor of political science at Kookmin University. Good to see you again, Professor.
Good evening.
So let's start our discussion with Dr. Kim, first with the big picture, of course. So we've been seeing China-Japan relations being deteriorating rapidly lately. What do you see as the structural causes behind this latest conflict?
You see, let me start with the immediate cause first. The immediate cause was Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi's remark made during the Q&A session at Japan's National Diet. She said China's invasion of Taiwan would constitute an existential threat to Japan, and that would justify Japan's military involvement in Taiwan situation. The structural forces of Sino-Japan conflicts are actually multifaceted. They would include Sino-Japan rivalry as the regional hegemon, bilateral territorial disputes over the Senkaku Islands or Diaoyudao in Chinese, Japan's ambition to reinvent itself as a normal country, which can go to war, deep-seated historical issues over Japan's wartime atrocities committed against China, rising nationalistic sentiments in both societies, and finally, China's perception of Japan as the stronghold of America's ambition in Northeast Asia. So the structural forces are multi-layered and multifaceted. Some of them are ideological, some of them are pragmatic, some of them are historical. So these rising tensions between the two countries are not simple.
Right, definitely. So a lot of factors are playing in this latest conflict that's developing. Now, on that note, China has recently strongly pushed back against the Japanese Prime Minister's comments, responding with domestic travel and study advisories regarding Japan and announcing the postponement of a ministerial level meeting as well. Professor Godin, how would you read into this? Do you think it's just simply about containing Japan, or is there a deeper political motive about this?
Well, as Dr. Kim rightly emphasized, this rivalry between China and Japan is multifaceted. But I think here the bottom line is relatively simple. China and Japan are competing economically, politically, militarily. But what's happening now is that China is definitely trying to prepare the invasion of Taiwan. When, we cannot tell. But eventually, this one China principle is the very basis of Chinese diplomacy. So now, the fact that any Asian country, and in particular Japan, that any Asian country will be able to question this objective is simply not to be accepted by China. China now is going through a serious economic crisis, and the invasion of Taiwan will serve two purposes. One will be, of course, economic, because Taiwan is a leader in particular, the production of semiconductors that China desperately needs. And also, as you mentioned, there's also a question of political cohesion. this Taiwan issue is obviously used by the Chinese authorities as a cover to basically hide their, for the moment, relative failure to boost against their economy. So long story short, China is preparing the invasion of China on the long run, and it is basically unacceptable for China that Japan would try to slow them down, basically.
So the intensity of China's reaction seems to reflect their ambitions around Taiwan, we're seeing. Now, when it comes to Japan's response, then, Prime Minister Takaichi has made no mention of retracting her remarks so far. Considering Japan's diplomatic and political climate, Dr. Kim, what direction do you think she's likely to take?
You know, I do not think Prime Minister Takaichi is going to formally retract her statement on Taiwan. If and when that happens, she would come across as either weak or blundering by her constituents. That would undermine her popularity built on her hawkish stance vis-à-vis China. Since the domestic approval rating of her performance has gone up dramatically from her standoff with China, retraction of her remark, I don't think is likely. You know, but what she can do is to downplay or refrain from making similar remarks in order to manage the current diplomatic crisis with Beijing. The Tokyo government is likely to utilize rhetorical gestures by expressing its willingness to engage in dialogue with Beijing. But as we have seen, China is not very responsive to those gestures.
So politically, it seems like we're seeing her standing her ground for now. But as you mentioned, as for Beijing's response, it has already warned of further action if there's no retraction coming from Japan. Professor Godong, some are actually saying China's so-called anti-Japan directive is now in full swing. So if Japan actually refuses to yield, how far do you think could China push its retaliatory measures?
For the moment, as Dr. Kim mentioned, Prime Minister Takaichi is walking on a very thin line. On the one hand, she cannot retract because politically it would be suicidal to her. But on the other hand, again, it is impossible for her to risk any further retaliation from China. So what Japan is doing now basically is trying to downplay the previous declarations of Prime Minister Takaichi. That being said, what Prime Minister Takaichi said is that should China invade Taiwan, Japan would have to take military actions. So what it means is that as long as China does not invade Taiwan for good, uh, there is nothing else Japan needs to do in order to substantiate these declarations. So right now, what is likely to happen is that most likely Prime Minister Takeshi is to dodge the issue, and if she keeps dodging it, eventually the Chinese government may get back to the way they used to do business a few months ago. Now, I think here the main issue is what happens when Taiwan actually gets invaded. What Prime Minister Takeshi has said is to result in consequences. She has made a statement, and this statement eventually will have to be substantiated. What she has said cannot be unsaid. It cannot be taken back without a formal retractation, and this formal retractation is not to happen realistically. So right now we are to keep navigating in these uncharted waters for a while, but I do not think neither China nor Japan are to say anything very substantial in the next weeks. What I am most concerned with is about what will happen when real military operations are to take place. For the moment, it's just words. The problem is more like what is to follow in the future when military action is to take place.
Right. So we are currently in a very tough position and at the brink of a potential military action. And so, in fact, the U.S. President Donald Trump, who could be a key player, a key influencer to both countries, he held phone calls last week with both the leaders of China and Japan. So, Dr. Kim, what do you think is the strategic message or the objective behind the American president's outreach?
It seems like President Trump wants to play a mediator's role between China and Japan. The sequence of his actions is actually quite interesting. Mr. Trump initiated the call with Prime Minister Takaichi at his own request, briefing her on his conversation with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And he has been maintaining distance from both sides, even though he and Ms. Takaichi signed an agreement on the bilateral, quote, new golden age, end quote, last October. He recently characterized U.S.-China relationship as extremely strong, and it is highly likely that the U.S. will maintain strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan issue as he is treating relationship with China as his priority. So President Trump seems to have his mission as mediator between the disputing countries in this region, but at the same time, he seems to prioritize American relationship with China over that with Japan.
Thank you for that opinion, Dr. Kim. But staying on that front, there are also growing concerns that President Trump is more focused on now on trade and economic negotiations rather than its traditional security issues. So from this angle, Professor Godang, how does this China-Japan conflict potentially strengthen America's negotiating leverage?
Well, it is probably not a good time to be a US ally these days, because what Trump prioritizes, as you said, it's trade. It is US interest, plain and simple. So for now, as Japan is seen to be a declining power in DC, I do not think Japan can be expecting any substantial support from the US government. And in fact, when it comes to what is happening in Taiwan, it is true that, I mean, Dr. Kim is very right to mention that now President Trump's strategy relies in ambiguity. But ambiguity is a very good position to be because it doesn't force you to take any action as long as the other power is not taking action either. So what it means is that for now, as long as China does not invade Taiwan for good, the US is in a good place. But should this invasion happen, then this will deal the cards again. Because for the moment, the US is heavily dependent on Taiwan, South Korea too, but mostly Taiwan, for these semiconductors that America is not producing for the moment. So should Taiwan get invaded, the US would become dependent on China, including for military technology, which Trump obviously cannot accept. So for the moment, Trump is postponing the issue, which is probably a smart move because he thinks that eventually China won't go one step too far. So right now, China and America are playing chicken, and Japan is just a pawn in this game, at least from President Trump's perspective. In his view, diplomacy is all about superpowers negotiating with one another. Say the US with Russia about Ukraine, but without Ukraine, the US with China about Taiwan, but without Taiwan and without Japan. That's the way President Trump envisions world relations.
So considering its national interest, it seems as though President Trump is pushing through with his America First policy indeed, even though, of course, Japan is a key ally of the United States. So I wonder how this is being received in Japan, Dr. Kim, and also what kind of effect might this silence from Washington have on the overall dynamics?
I can think of two words that would best describe the mood in Japan. They are anxiety and confusion. Trump's public silence on Japan's escalating dispute with China has frayed nerves in Tokyo. Some seem to think that Trump may be prepared to soften its support for Taiwan in pursuit of a trade accord with China. This is particularly so because a similar behavior was recorded in the 1970s when the Nixon administration normalized its relations with China. Trump's ambiguous stance, ambiguity, could have serious regional implications. Japan seems to fear that if the US and the world are prepared to accept forced border changes in Europe through Russian aggression, they could also decline to intervene in the case of China's attack on Taiwan. The overall US attitude of ambiguity indeed leaves Tokyo in the precarious position. It is forced to absorb China's pressure while remaining uncertain about American backing, but at the same time, it is unable to fundamentally pivot away from Washington. This is Japan's dilemma. In response to America's ambiguity, Japan is likely to intensify its hedging strategy. It needs to bolster its defense capabilities, recalibrate alliance, and expand security partnerships. To diversify its diplomatic options, Japan is strengthening its ties with Europe, the UK, Australia, and other partners as an insurance against American unpredictability. So Japan is trying to do something about America's ambiguity, but at the same time, it has limited options, unfortunately.
So, with mounting tensions continuing in the region, so we are expecting a trilateral between Korea, China, and Japan in January. So, if this trilateral cooperation actually weakens because of this rising tensions lately, Professor Godang, what might that mean for Northeast Asia?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that ever since Trump was elected, there has never been that many international meetings all the time. Because ever since Trump has come back to power, it means that the UN and all of the places for international negotiation have literally collapsed. There doesn't seem to be anything as a stable international order anymore. It is all about state by state, leader to leader negotiations. So typically between the US and China, typically between US and Russia, etc., etc. What it means for Northeast Asia, you're right, is concerning because middle powers, not to mention smaller powers, do not bear any significance in Trump's worldview. And the problem is that in East Asia, you do not have any democratic power that would be sizable enough alone to basically fight back against Trump. So what Japan is trying to do now, that is strengthening links with Australia, with the EU, is probably the right way to proceed, but it is happening a bit too late. The diplomacy that President Lee Jae-myung is trying to push for is very similar because what Lee Jae-myung is trying to do in Korea is trying to strengthen ties with all democratic powers all over the world. So that's the one way to go, obviously. We need some sort of normalcy because Korea and Japan realistically are not powerful enough to fight back against China. They are not powerful enough alone to live without America. And so strengthening ties with other democratic powers is the right way to go. The only concern, of course, is whether it's not too late. That's the right way to go. Now, the key issue is time, in my opinion. The sooner, the better.
Definitely. Now, with this latest developments, the direction of South Korea's, path moving forward is also a big question. So, Dr. Kim, what kind of diplomatic course do you think Seoul should actually take moving forward between balanced diplomacy and value-based diplomacy? Where should South Korea stand right now?
You know, I believe South Korea is between rock and hard place. South Korea needs to tread precarious waters in order to secure not only its survival, but also its success in this rapidly shifting international and regional environment. Seoul is watching with mounting alarm as tensions between China and Japan escalate, a development that threatens to test its pragmatic diplomacy and its balancing act between Beijing and Washington. Korea needs to calmly observe rising Japan-China tensions and do its best to maximize its interest. I would predict that Seoul government would try to institutionalize trilateral engagement, as Seoul should prioritize China, Japan, South Korea trilateral framework as a neutral platform to manage tensions. Unlike Japan, which has explicitly stated its position, President Lee has already stated that South Korea would steer clear of military involvement in any Taiwan Strait conflict. That is the Korean version of strategic ambiguity. This allowed Seoul to maintain both its security alliance with Washington and economic ties with Beijing without being forced into an explicit choice. Lee administration emphasizes economic pragmatism over ideological alignment. That has been the fundamental principle of his diplomacy from the outset. And it will not choose a side escalating US-China tensions. So it will try to remain neutral. It will try to facilitate the tensions by institutionalizing certain mechanisms for the three countries in the region, and it will try to maximize its national interest without risking provoking any involved parties. This is going to be a tough call. We shall see how the Lee administration is going to manage this particular and very challenging tension.
Definitely. So South Korea's response from here could really shape its standing for years to come. Let's hope for a cautious approach to this. Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Kim.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Professor Godang, we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.